It's my great pleasure to introduce Sunetra Gupta, whom I've been reading for several years, though I just met her. And she's one of the most moving novelists. I think I remember early comments on her novels as describing her as a heir to Virginia Woolf. I'm sure that has stayed on. And I think she is. I mean, I've been always been very drawn to kind of the chronicling of the private, of the interior, and this certainly at a time when growing up reading novels through the 90s, the whole the bustle of the Indian novel was about the public, it was about kind of the public grandeur, the kind of partition, all of that. And much as I appreciated that, there was a thirst in many of us that, fiction about the quotidian, fiction about the really private, dark spaces. And there's a few writers who really bring out that as powerfully as Sunetra Gupta. They're immensely poetic, and she's written 5 novels, and not in this order: Glass Blows Breath, Moonlight into Marzipan, Memories of Rain, that's her first novel, A Sin of Color, and I believe most recently So Good in Black. Also, another thing about her is that I've always deeply appreciated writers in English who brought a shadow of the vernacular in their writing, and I think in Sunetra's case, the shadow of Bangla literature, the songs of Rabindranath Tagore, the kind of influence they cast on her writing has been really deeply seductive. It's really quite unique, quite contrary. So in many ways, I believe that there should be more discussion about her writing than we've had so far. There can be a good deal more, because I think we these days we often take novels just to talk about issues, and issues are of course important in an increasingly embattled world. We feel like things are slipping out, but the idea of using a novel just to talk about a certain political issue or a certain sort of issue is and a scientific issue, I mean, for that matter, the environment. Sunetra is also a scientist, professor of epidemiology at Oxford. We are losing a kind of vital relationship with literature that we could have, which is why I think the conversation about poetry is dying out, because poetry is not as easily commandeered to talk about issues as novels do, because they can just become anthropological. And I think her novels have resisted this anthropologizing trend very vigorously, which is why they've also unfortunately haven't come up in public discussion as much as they should, or many other lesser novels I think have come up. So with that in mind, it's my great delight to welcome her and and hear her talk. And I'm sure I know there's this in a past gathering of this, she spoke about deprofessionalization and what's it to have a scientist write novels. So there are many different angles, things she does. As far as what I've read of her, there was one character in Sin of Color, which is one of my favorite novels, who is also a scientist. But other than that, I haven't seen evidence of the scientific concerns, like, of course, the sort of powerful concerns which drive many of our novelists today, like global warming. I haven't seen those concerns in her work. But but with that in mind, I'm welcome Sunetra again. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Jacob, for that introduction. Is this working? Thank you very much. That echoes many of my own sentiments about why I write, and certainly I won't anthropologize and in talking about failure, nor will I bring up issues of global warming, although I might talk about the coronavirus frenzy. Right, so I wasn't sure what I wanted to talk about when Amit asked me if I'd like to come back and participate again in this, except I was very excited to be doing so, just because it's always such an extraordinary experience. Whereas when it came to deprofessionalization, I had a very clear idea what I wanted to talk about and had everything planned before I turned up. This time I had some thoughts, and many of the thoughts that I'm about to share with you here, I kind of gathered together yesterday during the course of hearing other people speak about failure. So that's what this is. So what I decided I really wanted to explore in responding to what people were talking about yesterday, and also the thoughts that I arrived here with, was I thought I'd quite like to embark upon a search for what I'm going to call pure failure. So kind of like a Russell Whitehead type kind of journey towards something that is pure failure, not failure that is encumbered by some kind of relationship with success. So what kinds of failure did I want to avoid? They're the sorts of... The reason because I wanted to search pure failure is because I felt that I'd been talking about failure before. I often talk about failure because regularly now I am asked to speak at conferences about women in science, or what it's like to be a scientist and an artist, and all of that. And in these public talks I often bring up failure. But I realized that the kind of failure that I talked about, kept trotting out, wasn't pure failure. The types of failure that I don't want to talk about are, for example, a kind of failure that I think of as the leeward side of success, the dry downward slope, the inevitable fall. And yesterday you heard a beautiful disquisition on the topic of how fall and fail elide. And we've all experienced that inevitable fall after any kind of success, small or large. And there is that kind of failure which is about falling, but it's not always about falling, even remaining stagnant, of feeling, of just I've achieved this sort of post-achievement sort of stagnant feeling is a kind of failure that I don't want to talk about, but nonetheless I cannot resist starting with an exposition of that feeling, which is captured with such extraordinary delicacy in Elizabeth Bishop's poem Crusoe in England. So I'm just going to read from that a little bit, just to sort of set the tone. So Crusoe in England says, "Now I live here, another island, that doesn't seem like one, but who decides? My blood was full of them, my brain bred islands, but that archipelago has petered out. I'm old, I'm bored too, drinking my real tea, surrounded by uninteresting lumber. The knife there on the shelf, it reeked of meaning. Like a crucifix, it lived. How many years did I beg it, implore it not to break? I knew each nick and scratch by heart, the bluish blade, the broken tip, the lines of wood grain on the handle. Now it won't look at me at all." So failure as an anticlimax to success is a common theme in literature, of course. Tennyson's Ulysses laments being stuck by this still hearth among these barren crags, matched with an aged wife. However, he feels 'tis not too late to seek a newer world, push off, and sitting well in order, smite the sounding furrows. He does acknowledge, we are now not now that strength which in the old days moved heaven and earth. That which we are, he says. Now that which we are, it does constitute a form of reconciliation with failure. And it is perhaps closer, in some ways, to the notion of pure failure, in being ultimately pathetic rather than heroic. But it still contains that impurity of an urge to succeed. And this kind of failure is ultimately one that only kind of comes to relief against the backdrop of success. Have I experienced this kind of failure? Well, yes, I have, and Amit did request that I bring some of my own experiences into this talk, which I was resisting in the way that we all resist bringing our experiences in. We resist it, and yet we know that there is a way in which we can use our own experiences that somehow justify it. It's difficult, isn't it? But I have experienced this kind of failure most spectacularly in my literary career, which, although I wasn't noticed very significantly in the 90s, I did still manage to publish 4 novels with a mainstream publisher, Orion Books, and A Sin of Colour was on the long list for the Orange Prize and that sort of thing, you know, which at least gave me a certain sense of smugness about where I was, or just made me feel secure. I enjoyed a certain security. But then, so that was the year 2000, and then it took me 4 years really, 5 years, to write So Good in Black, partly because I had young children. I'd just started my been appointed to the job that I now have. It was not a time when I was able to write very easily. So in 2005, when I went back to the publishers with my new novel, I was essentially told they weren't interested in publishing me, and not only were they not interested in publishing me, essentially mainstream publishing I realised was completely closed off to me, and it was quite scary. I think and of course, as I said, this is not pure failure, but I think since then I have been able to turn that into pure failure, but more of that later. There is another kind of failure which I talk about often. It's very much the kind of failure one trots out in a public lecture, and that is where failure is a ladder to success. And that too, I think, does not qualify as pure failure. It's a sort of thing, you know, that you say to reassure people that, you know, you're failing your French O levels, not the end of the world. You can still go on to be me. And I shouldn't be so flippant. There are, of course, lessons to be learnt from showing how failure can be a ladder to success. And one that I talk about a lot is a recent example from my science. So I work on infectious diseases, and I use mathematical models to try and understand how the agents of infectious disease, the viruses, the bacteria, the parasites that cause infectious disease, how they evolve. So this is often seen as a kind of esoteric, very theoretical activity, but still has been, you know, clearly there's a niche for it, and I've been able to exploit that to make a living. But a lot of the work that I've done in that area, even though, of course, it's led me to have this position, a very secure academic position, has actually, because it is quite heterodox in its, essentially quite heterodox. I mean, most of the work that I've published really goes against the grain of how people believe pathogens evolve. And so it's not been met with, shall we say, unalloyed enthusiasm by the scientific community, who either have deride or ignore it. And it's been I mean, it sounds weird to say, or it may seem surprising that I would say this, you know, as a successful academic, as a professor at Oxford, but it's been a really tough 25 years for me, trying to put across my theory of how I think pathogens evolve, which departs, interestingly, from a sort of linear narrative that's established in people's heads about how virus populations march through time and how bacteria stagnate in time. But so the theory that I have been trying to put out there for last 25 years challenges that completely and creates a much more non-linear narrative. And as I said, it's been roundly rejected. And about 12 years ago, we took this idea and applied it to influenza. And this was particularly met with huge amounts of criticism from the academic community. What's interesting is that so that was pure, it was real failure, and it's tangible. You know, you look at the citations of other papers in the field, and you look at yours, and you can see that you're not being cited. People aren't talking about you when they give lectures on flu and that sort of thing. What we did then, though, was to try and test this theory through experiment, and this led us to identify a new way of making a flu vaccine that would protect you against all strains of flu. As many of you know, what currently happens is there is a vaccine for flu available every season, but that vaccine stops working in 2 or 3 years because flu changes. So if you get a flu vaccine, it won't work for very long. You have to update the flu vaccine regularly. And what we have identified is a way to make a vaccine that will protect you against flu forever. So like measles, you can get it when you're a baby and you'll never get flu again. So this is something we were able to patent, and we now have industrial investment in it, and it's now being developed quite seriously as a universal flu vaccine. And the truth is, if people had believed me 10 years, 12 years ago, they would have gone and done this themselves, and I wouldn't be here saying I'm making a universal flu vaccine. So that's a very kind of tangible example of where failure has led to, well, not quite success yet, but has created the conditions for me to at least embark upon something which nobody thought I would be able to do. So this sort of kind of lesson, sort of story about failure as a means of success, I mean, to talk about it does send the message. It's not simply about perseverance, but it's a process. Failure is a process of refinement and rebalancing. And indeed, of course, it's not surprising that almost every talk has alluded to Beckett's inducement to fail better. There is, even in that, a sort of sense of this sort of forward movement in failure, that you fail and then you fail better. Well, it's perfectly possible that what Beckett really meant by fail better was to sink further and more deliciously into the state of failure. But this kind of sense of a forward movement of failure as just a necessary process, a set of steps that lead to success, is also not one that I want to really talk about, although that is what one ends up generally talking about when it comes to failure. Because there is in that a sort of triumphalism, a kind of sort of sense that we can conquer and defeat failure, and I think that's quite detrimental to, you know, it's a mentality that's affected a lot of global politics and notions of prosperity. And I will bring up the new sort of panic over the coronavirus pandemic. I mean, here I think is a fairly harmless virus. Yes, it kills people. So does flu. So do most viruses when they infect vulnerable individuals. But the sort of our attitude towards it's been very much that we have to hunt it down, kill it, conquer and defeat it, and that's how we also speak about cancer, about disease in general. And I think this kind of notion of failure as something that we have to defeat is therefore a problem, and I want to avoid that. And there is, of course, as Tiffany mentioned, there is indeed a growing industry in this kind of way of sort of seeing failure. What did you call it? Fail lit. I noticed on the tube the other day this book by Elizabeth Day, which I think you referred to, which is called How to Fail, and it's sort of presented upside down, the title. And it's the subtitle's Everything I've Learnt from Things Going Wrong. It was billed on tube as a celebration of imperfection. And again, I mean, imperfection, of course, is not failure. Failure is a gritty business. It's not about being imperfect. So that's that kind of failure, in other words, can be commoditized and appropriated by industry. And I think that, again, it does not qualify as pure failure. So what then is pure failure? Pure failure is clearly a state from where there is no possibility of this forward movement or unidirectional forward movement. There is no guaranteed exit. Again, as Tiffany said, it's just so beautiful, that slip of tongue, the one door closes, another door shuts. You're stuck. There is no guaranteed exit. So what would my user's manual be concerned with? My user's manual then would be concerned with how does one endure this state of pure failure, and maybe render it into what one might call a productive state, although that is a question. But how does one grapple with this state of pure failure? So I've thought of, and indeed, of course, that's what I've been, I think, that is what I've been trying to construct for myself, is a kind of user's manual to deal with failure. How can one remain in an ongoing conversation with failure? And I think I've come up with a few things, many of which, as I said, I've gleaned from what was said yesterday. So the first sort of possibility is to constructively use repeated failure. And Shumona yesterday talked about beautifully on ray and the failure of light, the failure of the fading of the image. And indeed, Anurag Kashyap talked about his sequence of glorious failures, and I thought that those distinguished themselves from that sort of forward sort of ladder of failure leading to success, in that it was a sort of constructive use of repeated failure. There was that ongoing conversation with failure. There was an oscillation between success and failure. So there was failure, and then, you know, Ray would turn that into success, or Anurag Kashyap. Well, success was almost like a poison. He'd achieve success, it was poison him, and then he'd again sort of court failure so that he could find success, but then with the knowledge that that success would poison. So there is one possibility of an ongoing conversation with failure, which is to turn failure into success, or indeed run away or shut out the poison of success itself. But what bothers me about that solution is that it does rely on a certain level of creativity and entrepreneurship, and indeed the aleatory. So it's not something that one can rely upon. It's not available to everybody, that kind of constructive use of repeated failure. How else can one use failure? How else have I used failure? Well, one can use failure to liberate yourself from the constraints of success. Ranajit Das spoke eloquently about creating that sort of protected space for his poetry, in which I think is a great example of that. And this is where I think my own experience in the literary industry has afforded me that. It's given me that the failure, the rejection by the mainstream publishers has led me to independent publishers like Women Unlimited, and Ritu Menon is in Egypt now, but she would have certainly been here otherwise, and that's been a wonderful experience being published by her and by Interlink Books in America. It's actually, so that's been a great experience, engaging with the sort of publisher who actually wants to be publishing the kind of work I do. But also it's just liberated me as a writer. I know I feel differently about my relationship with what I write. It's true, I never did, as Shoykot said, I never did try and, pursue a course that would put me in the literary limelight, but it's created even more of a breathing space for me to do exactly what I want, and actually not even care whether I get published anymore. I mean that. I've just finished, well, actually it's been a year since I finished my 6th novel, and it's going back and forth between myself and my crazy literary agent, and whom I adore, who also doesn't care. Publishing. And it's just great. I love it. I love where I am. So that's one way that I've used failure to liberate myself from the constraints of success. But perhaps even more importantly, and something I spoke about in the last time I was at this meeting, was my decision to pursue 2 careers, each perhaps to the detriment of the other, as has been suggested by many. And of course, I can't say I've completely failed in either of them, but I've also, I mean, it's possible that I haven't achieved the success that I might have been able to achieve, and certainly that was suggested to me by an American writer I very much admire in other respects quite recently. And I thought about it, and because he said to me, you know, you should do one thing and do it well. And I thought about it, and I've said this before, so it can't have been that recently. It was at least 4 years ago. So I said this in the previous meeting that I was at. But I thought about it, and I thought, I don't do things in order to do them well. I mean, obviously, I want to do them to the best of my capability and have a desire to fulfill myself in doing what I'm doing. But that's not my primary motivation. I do what I do because I need to do it. I want to do it, and I'm not motivated. Success, in the terms that, well, we're using it here, has not been my primary motivation. Amit talked about how the inability to fail itself is a kind of curse, and I think that reminded me of what John Berger says about Picasso and why he is not, in his mind, as important as an artist as many others, because Picasso just found a way to be successful and stayed there. I mean, he kept doing what he did really well, but that's all he did. So I think that there are lots of ways in which failure can liberate and of course extend what you're doing. The other thing that failure can do is it can, which Amit mentioned as well, is it can empty you out and create a space for replenishment. The Tagore song that you mentioned. Amare tumi oshesh korecho, puraye pele abar porecho, jibono nobu nobu. So failure can, of course, again, but that requires this, as I said, this continued conversation with failure. It has to empty you out and then abar porecho, it has to fill you again and again and empty and fill you. And then finally, and this actually brings me to the question of suicide, failure can also reduce you to reduce one. So maybe you can't be replenished. Maybe you get to the point where you can't be replenished. So but it's what has it done in that case? It's reduced you to the essential. But what does it do then? It does, I think, allow you to claim for yourself a space where, maybe I'm disagreeing with you here, Clancy, but where you can't fail. And I think that's what Greek tragedy is all about, this sort of willful self-destruction that we see, for example, in Oedipus, in Antigone. I mean, those are sort of forms of suicide, but they carry with them, and that was the word you ended with, enormous dignity. And that's what I was thinking, Shokat, when you asked the question. I was sort of thinking, well, I can answer it when my talk, even if Clancy doesn't. It's this sort of holding on to dignity, human dignity, which is so important, and so much so that tragedy, as Terry Eagleton said in a recent article in reviewing the LRB, tragedy was a form of, in Athens, tragedy was a form of ethico-political education for the city-state as a whole, not just a night out for the toffs. It was paid for the state. There was even a state fund that the poor could use if they didn't have, and they couldn't afford the entry fee. So this impulse to suicide, I think, is something that falls within, for me, the category of using failure to liberate yourself. And those acts of self-care that you mentioned, I think, fit into that idea of tragedy. And I was interested, because I don't know enough about Freud, about what you said about this business of suicide being a displaced murder, and then also what you said about the mother. And it made me think, actually, maybe Medea, where there isn't a suicide, that's a sort of inversion. That's a suicide that should be a suicide that becomes the murder of the children. And so this kind of using failure, I mean, that self-destruction, I think, is a liberation and I think it should be offered the dignity, it should be accorded the dignity that it deserves. And I thank you for your talk, because I think it did that. So number 3 on the list of what you can do with failure is there's a little bit more levity. It's actually, or maybe not, it's a specific enjoyment of the condition of failure. Rilke calls us wasters of sorrows. He accuses us of not employing sorrow in the way that we should. We avoid sorrow rather than we waste our sorrows. And there has been some discussion, of course, here of the sublime, the nectar of failure. But what I want to talk about, again, from my personal point of view, is not really that. It's not sort of failure. Let's enjoy the sort of beauty of failure. Not that I haven't. I have spoken or written about the nectar of decay anyway, a lot in my books. But I think at a slightly more theoretical level, I think that there is a failure that we really enjoy and delight in, which is our fundamental failure to represent reality. And this is something that I can speak of both in fiction and in science. So in fiction, I've spoken of how I exploit the gap that exists between the word and its referent, and how I exploit and enjoy the inadequacies of grammar, syntax, narrative. And there's a very ludic space that is presented, that's there in that, as I said, fundamental sort of structural failure of language to represent reality. And this is also true in science, and which may surprise some of you, but in fact, mathematics, particularly what I use as a language in science, mathematical modelling. So here I am trying to model infectious disease systems, and I'm using mathematics. And this is, in some ways, it is predicated on the failure of these abstractions to actually represent these realities. And there is a sort of almost a movement, even among scientists, to say, oh no, models have to become more realistic. But it is actually precisely the avoidance of realism that gives models the power that allows us to gain insights into systems. And this is something that was kind of revealed to us, and this is not new. Classical physics was sort of very fundamental in revealing this fundamental principle of failure, this fundamental failure that underlies everything that we do, which is something we should celebrate, because it's really we've used that failure, or we have lived within that failure very successfully. We have written equations that have allowed us to send rockets to the moon. I mean, that's how well we have exploited that relationship with reality, which is one essentially of failure. Finally, I just wanted to I was interested, Pratap Mehta's talk was something very, very new to me. I never thought of it that way, about failure, the relationship between the individual and failure, and how one way to maybe avoid failure is to shift the locus away from the individual. And of course, I suppose that is how people used to deal with failure in pre-modern times. And then, of course, as Pratap Mehta so beautifully explained, the individual became the cause, the agent, rather than the effect. But this still there's still a very complicated relationship between agency and effect here, which makes it difficult to entirely shift the locus of failure away from the individual, or, well, I suppose what you might say is modernism returned the locus, or put the burden, shifted the burden again, or the modern, not modernism, the entering the state of the modern, shifted the locus back to the individual and highlighted this complicated relationship between agency and effect. But I rather think this can be resolved through the social contract, and I think that, and Tiffany brought this up as well, I mean, what if we see failure in the context of our social contract. I think that does find a very strong place in the user's manual of failure. And also, I think it leads to failure being, as Amit said, a natural and viable way to be. I think that's what we're trying to do, is to find ways in which failure can be a natural and viable way to be. And I suppose the central question maybe here is, and which has been a sort of running theme throughout these various conferences, is where does the market come into this? What is the market going to do? Can failure be a natural and viable way of existence? What is in relation to a market? And I think one thing that we haven't done much during the course of the last yesterday and today is think about the market as not being, there's not one type of market, there are various types of market. And it seems to me that it's sort of inevitable that the free market, there's no place for failure, or for failure to be a natural and viable way to be within the free market. Because the free market not only does it not allow failure on part of us as writers and actors, but it doesn't even permit failure on part of the reader. So, I mean, there is simply no place clearly in the free market with its sort of runaway selection for success and the grotesqueries that creates for failure. But I wonder if there is some sort of sustainability of failure that's possible within a regulated market, a market that respects the social contract. I don't know. It's a big question. It's not one that I'm even that I could even start to answer, but it's a question that I'd like to really leave you with. Is there a possibility for a kind of regulated market in which failure is sustainable, or does failure have to be the preserve of the temple? Do we have to distinguish between the market and the temple? Or in distinguishing between the market and the temple, is failure something that can only reside within the temple rather than the market? I'm going to leave it there.
Thank you, Sunetra. I think there's been nothing quite for this morning's sessions to remind us of our mortality, and I think the talk on coronavirus comes as refreshingly, innocuous after, I think, Clancy's talk in the morning. But it's really, and I think what Sunetra said about her relationship with publishing goes to the heart of the ongoing theme of the literary activism seminars, which is intervention into a literary public sphere. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions. I want to start off with a small question, because when you were turning the page, I did take the liberty of glimpsing at the page, and I saw there was a blank page in between, and then you moved on to a page where things were written, and that got me thinking about the theme of abstraction, because abstraction, I think, is a running theme in your talk, and you talked about fiction and reality, fiction and abstraction, and then the most striking thing was when you're talking about mathematical models, using mathematical models to understand empirical reality. And I don't know much about science at all, but I know this is a hugely debated thing, that whether you can use like something like the Turing model, or whether you can at all understand what is essentially physical and sensory through the abstraction of mathematics. And I think in some ways that has been a kind of a concern in your fiction too, like kind of reality and its representation, whether. And so I was thinking if you could maybe just talk a little more about abstraction, because in some ways I was also thinking of Michelle's talk yesterday, that this whole idea that you kind of move from this soiled sensory immediate state to standing up, which is in some ways a kind of move towards abstraction, to kind of understand things from a distance and kind of conceptualize it, as opposed to being mired in the sensory immediacy. And so much of the struggle of art is about that, whether do you get trapped in the sensorium, or do you kind of look beyond the abstract and the concrete. And I was wondering if you would, and of course, the title of your talk, Pure Failure, and purity is in some ways the ultimate abstraction, right? I mean, is there something that is ever possible as pure? And it almost seems to me that, this search for abstraction has to be a drive for success. And the question is, is failure always concrete? Is failure always messy? I mean, can't help by thinking of failed suicide attempts and why we put our little things away, our shoes, our glasses, our, while to kind of create a tidy picture. But is failure concrete? Is failure material? And is this quest for abstraction, a kind of a drive towards success? I'm obviously thinking of even the Enlightenment attempt to sort of understand privilege abstract knowledge over concrete knowledge, the mind over the body. So I know it's a very kind of messy question itself, but I hope
it's a great question, and yes, indeed, it did not escape me when I was talking about pure failure that there was an irony in that. That pure failure is, and in fact, I had written in my notes yesterday. Maybe I should talk about how pure failure itself could be a sort of success, but one can keep going. But in terms of abstraction, I mean. In terms of actually specifically feeling liberated, I remember when I was studying physics and just knowing that actually there is no such thing as this table. Even something, when you talk about sensory experience, this doesn't exist. It's just what I am making of it through the intervention of my senses. And that can be frightening, but actually for me it was really liberating to think that we will never. No, there is no such thing as a reality. This doesn't actually exist. I mean, I don't mean it's Berkeleyan way, but I mean, it's just that there is such a thing as the universe, but the only route we have for perceiving that universe, I mean, our senses are the only way we can perceive it. So everything that we can construct, everything that we see that we think is concrete is actually a construction through it, but everything is a model, but it's a useful model because by constructing this thing as a table or a glass, I can use it. I can drink water out of it. I think that's Clancy's glass.
A philosopher's glass. So you may want to be careful. There's that about that vision.
Dark. But exactly. So. But that was, and you're right, that has informed and guided my relationship both with science and with literature, is also that, one is grappling with something that is ultimately impossible to represent, but rather than being defeated by that failure is something to actually rejoice in, if it is.
Right.
Or to play with, to live with it, to have, to remain engaged with, without this sort of sense of, eventually if I make a better model, I will be able to get better insights, or if I write a better novel, it will, say more profound things about, or I will get a better understanding of how the human mind works, or,
I mean, sensory language becomes a kind of an irony that why try to be sensory when that representation is always, but that's the project the postmodernists, I think, gave up, that, don't even bother to try because it's all, but...
That's right, and there's one thing I didn't touch on, which is the role of, obviously, surrealism and and actually of nonsense. We talked a little bit about nonsense, but and you talked about the armour of irony today, which, I mean, that there is that well, it can both be an armour, but it can also, I mean, an armour is also something to. It's not always just a signal of failure. I think an armour is a way of dealing with something. It's not. It's a way of accepting something.
Yeah, I'd like to invite other people to join the discussion. So questions. Yeah, Tiffany.
Thank you. That was fascinating. I feel my brain fizzing in all kinds of directions, and I think I probably lack the ability to follow a lot of those fantastic suggestions. But one of the metaphors that kind of sprang into my mind when we were talking about pure failure, and failure as a toxin, which came up yesterday, and then eventually you sort of saying, well, I got to a point where I didn't care. I wondered if there was a way of thinking about inoculation. There's something about sort of pure failure that sort of, if it happens, it somehow inoculates you, and again, I'm talking out of my remit here, very obviously, but it somehow it stops in its tracks that cycle that has to end in success in some way. And it seems to me that to be able to say, I've been through, to take the example of literary success, however that is measured, to be able to say, well, I'm writing this thing and I just don't care. I mean, that in a sense is a mark of being inoculated, is it not, from the cycles?
The question is, what was I inoculated by? Was I inoculated by?
Was it by? Yes.
I've now been vaccinated against success.
And
but was
failure.
it through?
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know how the logic works.
I know, but
yeah,
what were the ingredients of that vaccine? Was it the success? Was it the failure? The leeward side of failure? Of success? What? I don't know. It's a combination of, and again, it's a complex combination of success and failure. I think perhaps that's the one thing that, in terms of a theme throughout, we keep turning our failures into successes, and then the success itself is toxic, but then we retreat from that and seek failure, but then we can't just reside within failure, we then turn that into success. I mean, there's a sort of dynamic here, I think, that is uncovered, perhaps.
Rinkali?
Okay, I'm not even sure this is a question, and I was hesitating because I was wondering whether what I was going to say would be so obvious that it doesn't merit saying, but I'll say it anyway. The question was, how does one measure failure? So Tiffany used the word measure, in fact, just now in her question. But so if you measure failure in terms of success, which is what you were trying not to do, but even if then you measure it in terms of allowing you a space to be, it is in some way still related to success, though not material success. So what I'm trying to say is, if failure is measured in relation to the outer world, the world that's all around you, that is one sort of failure and one sort of measuring of it. There is the other sort that I think Clancy's talk pointed toward, which is where you judge yourself to be a failure, and there is almost no coming out of it. I mean, there may be a coming out of it, and for some people there may be no coming out of it, because the sense I got was that it is the harshness of about. I mean, it's a complicated thing, and I don't want to sort of simplify it into that one moment of but it is in a sense, from what I understand, a sort of self sort of condemnation, in the sense that this is just not worth the life itself, that my life itself is not worth the continuing of it. So just that basic. So just to voice that basic thought that we measure. So when we measure a failure outwardly, and there can be many manifestations of it, it's still something that one can perhaps deal with or find a space, against. But what happens? So there are different ways. I mean, the two different ways of sort of actually measuring failure, and what happens when there is no coming out of that internal measurement, the measurement that's internal to us.
Okay, so as you say, form an answer, and my answer is that I think all failure is internal. It may be, or at least the failure that I was talking about. Some of those, so it's a failure, but those internal demands or the desiderata are conditioned, obviously, in part externally. So I mean, in fact, actually, it's hard. I might turn your question. It's quite hard to think of how your sense of internal failure could arise in the absence of some sort of external input about what you might be failing at. And actually, one of the earlier thoughts I had when I was struggling with what to say here was I was, we were going through the Ten Commandments and how, what the different versions of the Ten Commandments in different religions and cultures, and it's quite interesting. So I think in the, at least according to Wikipedia, what the Ten Commandments differ, well, the commandments as such differ a lot, and I think one of the versions, the Buddhist version, said that thou shalt not feel remorse. You know, I mean, there are all sorts of things, but I think all failure as experienced is internal. I mean, everything that I've talked about here is your sense of failure. And yes, of course, that's externally conditioned, because where else would it come from?
We have.
No.
Very quickly, and then sadly we have to take for lunch. I also wanted to just add to the introduction. You know, because we've been talking about failing, but some of us, including yourself, have experienced also great success. In your case, as a scientist, in the last 10 years, I mean, you won the Rosalind Franklin Award, meant for, you know, the most distinguished scientist that particular year, in the eyes of a jury or whatever, for a woman scientist in Britain. Then you had your portrait painted. That was commissioned by The Guardian, and with you were part of a pantheon of 10 women scientists. And your portrait was up where? In the National...
The Royal Society.
Royal Society.
Mm-hmm.
And then you've had this amazing thing, a huge sum of money given for your future research on the flu virus, which was a big thing. I mean, you have been to... It's you can't talk about it yourself, but you know all these things have happened in the last 10 years, while in a parallel kind of life, you've been writing your novels. But I was interested, as somebody who has experienced that arc and then this huge success as a scientist. I mean, does it actually have any kind of experiential meaning? I mean, are you aware of success? Does one become aware of success? What does it mean or feel like? Or does it feel like nothing? Or does it feel like something?
I mean, it's pretty transitory, whatever feeling success. Yes, it is quite transitory, isn't it? I mean, I guess the biggest success I feel I've had was just in being published at all, which was something I experienced, about 30 years ago now. And that was because that was probably the most unlike, you know, in terms of biggest hurdle. Yeah, I mean, it's true. We haven't said anything in praise of success and at all in this meeting. And I was thinking that, and you know, I mean, one shouldn't deny that there is that sort of.
Success is praised quite frequently.
It is, yeah. I know we don't have to, but.
Reality is what I was interested in. We seem to have forgotten it very easily, but most of us have experienced success of some kind.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
We haven't maybe talked about it because I don't know if it has.
I mean, it doesn't, because I think it is immediate, which is why I started with the Crusoe poem. I mean, you know, it's immediately followed by the fall from success. That you know, you're immediately, you're on top of the summit, and then you're facing the descent.
What about happiness? Is it possible to be aware that you're happy, or is it something you?
Does it make me happy?
No. Is it possible to? I was asking transplanting the question about success to happiness. Is it possible to be aware in the present? I am happy now, or is it something you become aware of in retrospect? Sorry, I mean, I'm just.
Oh, I see. In the moment, do you feel happy?
I'm happy. Oh, I'm so happy. Or somebody says to you, you must be very happy because you know this is happening.
I mean, there are different experiences, aren't there? You know, I mean, in the moment that you're told, oh yeah, you've won that prize, you sort of feel, oh yeah, that's good. You know, let's go and have a drink. Then afterwards, or yay, you know, it's that moment. It's yay happiness, like yay. But
Happiness is a construct.
no, I don't think so. Happiness is, I think, real, but I think happiness for me attaches more to the conversation with failure than the experience of success.
See, there are a couple of other questions, but I think we have kind of. Can we take maybe one more or no?
Well,
Maybe
we can always
should.
talk
We can
outside.
just talk outside, and let's be back by 2 o'clock for the next session, because so that we can start on time and keep going. Okay. Thank you very much.